So today I'm going to attempt an album ranking, which I haven't done for a long time, and I'm going to look at Thomas Dolby. And the reason for this, really, I've been inspired by having seen Dolby in the last few days. I went to Manchester to see him. It was a tremendous gig, absolutely loved it. Also, he was supported by Martin McAloon from Prefab Sprout, and that was an incredible experience seeing Martin. That has also inspired me to do a Prefab Sprout video, which is long overdue, but I'm going to wait a couple of weeks to do that. I have made a video about Thomas Dolby before, quite a few years ago now, a sort of career retrospective, and I showed my collection in that video. So I'll link to that down below if you want to know more about Thomas's career, because I'm not going to go into all the ins and outs of that today. Yeah, just a great electronic pop pioneer from the post-punk years. Had a couple, well, he had one big hit and then a couple of fluffed hits, really. Hits that were not hits, but I suppose you'd classify them as radio hits. They got airplay, but for one reason or another they didn't get much chart traction, and he was basically consigned to being a cult artist in the end. He's got a big fan following, but it's definitely a kind of, it's a contained following, and Dolby fans are very committed, very passionate. It was great to be at that concert. Huge amount of love and affection for the guy. So yeah, why not? Let's just try an album ranking and see where we get to. So I'm not going to include some of the stuff he did. I'm not going to include the Gothic soundtrack. He did the Howard the Duck soundtrack as well. I'm not going to include that. I'm going to try to list some favourite songs, and a couple of them are not on the album, so I'll do that at the end. I'll pick a couple of favourite songs from each record, so we'll have a list by the end of some Dolby tracks to check out. He is one of those artists that, he's very well known for maybe 2 or 3 tracks, and that tends to be all that people know, and it's a shame because he has such a broad career and such a vast gamut of musical styles in his armoury. Anyway, let's see how we get on. So I'm going to rank all 5 of the studio albums to date, and I like all these albums, but and on a different day they might have come in a different order. Coming in last place, we're going to have Aliens Ate My Buick, which I think came out in 1988. I think this was pretty much the first Dolby album I got into. My friend David Chandler, who might be watching, turned me on to Dolby. It would have been, I don't know, in the late 80s, and this is an album that I seem to remember when I was a student, had it in my car on a tape and, listened to it constantly. This album is sort of Dolby doing his kind of funky R&B style. I don't want to say pastiche exactly, but it's kind of his version of 80s urban black music, mixed in with some of the stuff that he was more known for. So you've got tracks like Hot Sauce and Pop Culture, which are the sort of, the kind of R&B funk, P-funk kind of tracks. May the Cube Be With You is the other R&B style song. Well, a couple of tracks have a more traditional Dolby feel. The great standout is probably Budapest by Blimp, which is just a tremendous song. The start of that song, it begins with a keyboard intro, this wonderfully evocative keyboard solo, really, or introduction, is possibly my favourite passage of music of all time. Wonderful chords. Dolby came up on that scene in the early 80s doing, I suppose you'd call it electro pop, but there was a lot more to him than that. He was very interested in roots music, in soul and blues and R&B and progressive rock. He was a big fan of the Grateful Dead, and he sort of weaved all these influences into his music. This record is coming at the bottom of the pile, I think, maybe because it's the least melodic of the albums he did. There was more of that focus on the rhythm and on that kind of funky R&B thing, that sort of Prince kind of sound. And I think maybe just a slight paucity of the usual Dolby atmosphere and melodicism, but it's still a fun album. It's one that I'm really fond of. So coming in at 4th place, we have Dolby's most recent album, actually, that came out a few years ago now. This is a map of the floating city, and I would describe this as a grower for certain. It's got some wonderful stuff on it, some great melodic tracks. Road to Reno, The Toad Lickers, both fantastic. A Jealous Thing Called Love is a really beautiful ballad, and Oceana, which has got a bit of a kind of autotune on it, I think, a kind of vocoder autotune kind of effect. It's a really nice mixture, actually. It's a mixture of technology and more rootsy kind of music. And I suppose you could say that that is Dolby's formula or recipe, really, mixing more rootsy stuff up with technology. I don't think anybody else quite did it in the way he did it. You know, you had the sort of the techno pop artists in the 80s, and then you sort of had the rootsier people, but Dolby seemed to find a way of linking them together in a way that was uniquely him. It's a really, really nice album. It took a while to grow on me. There's a couple of things I'm not so keen on about it, which I suppose is why it's down in the bottom half of the list. I mean, I'm not a huge fan of modern music and the way it's recorded, and I can hear that on some of these tracks. It's got a bit of that kind of flat kind of laptop sound, and there's a couple of tracks that are built around loops, which I'm not so keen on. But the best stuff on this record is really enjoyable, very well crafted, just great songwriting, and I think one of his best albums vocally, actually. Really, really, I think on the previous album to this, which we'll get to in a minute, I think he really came into his own as a singer, but on this record he definitely continued that. Big gap, actually, between this and the next album we're going to look at, years and years, in fact. So we'll do number 3, and this is the album really that signalled the end of his pop career. He went away for a long time, went away and got into the world of technology and IT, worked for Nokia and did all kinds of things, and then came back with that last album. But this was the one that he made prior to that long career break. Astronauts and Heretics, which I think came out in 92. In some ways, this album could have come at number 1 for me. It's the one I probably listened to the most. This came out the year that I graduated, back in 92, and it just so evokes for me just that year that I graduated from uni, moved to Leeds, started a new life, formed a band, and all sorts of stuff going on. And I just love it. I think it's an absolutely wonderful record. It's Dolby. There's a bit of a tension on this record, I think, between him maybe wanting to start to explore some more adult contemporary kind of sounds. There's a couple of tracks which they could almost be sort of Elton John songs, really. Things like Beauty of a Dream, Close But No Cigar is a lovely Beatlesy, McCartney-ish kind of pop song that was a single. So he's moving into that kind of mainstream pop, maybe slightly AOR territory, which was sort of in his DNA. I mean, prior to him getting a solo career, he produced Foreigner, and he worked with Joni Mitchell, so he definitely had that in his armoury. But it's kind of set into tension on this record with a bit of sort of rootsy stuff again. The first track, I Love You Goodbye, has got a Cajun violin, and that is a wonderful song, a great favourite of mine. Silk Pyjamas has got a bit of a French Louisiana kind of feel to it, a bit of New Orleans style piano. And then you've got stuff which is more traditionally Dolby. I Live in a Suitcase, which is a great epic track, great electronic masterpiece, really, with a great soaring vocal. Eastern Bloc, which is a sequel to Europa and the Pirate Twins from his first album, features an amazing guitar solo from Eddie Van Halen, and actually also on this album, on Beauty of a Dream, there's a guitar contribution from Bob Weir and Jerry Garcia as well, although Dolby apparently, he had to cut Jerry Garcia's attempt at a solo into bits and just basically reassemble it in his computer for various reasons. But a really interesting album. Like I said, a mixture of stuff, really, sort of trying to head towards adult contemporary, but then being pulled back into more of a rootsy kind of sound with the electronic stuff thrown in. In a way, you could maybe say it was a bit of an identity crisis album for him. It was the last album he did, like I said, before he took this long career sabbatical, and essentially it was because of career frustrations, lack of record company support, and Dolby, I think Dolby was a major artist that could have been. He should have been huge, and for various reasons that didn't happen. And, he was destined to be a cult artist, but that is a well-loved album by Dolby fans. Certainly by me. It could have come at number 1 on a different day. The only album he made for Virgin, actually, at the end of his career, at the end of his run of albums that he'd done with EMI. He had a very fractured relationship with EMI. Okay, so number 2 and number 1. Now these two, you'll know what they are already if you know anything about Dolby, and these two could have come the other way. I ummed and ahed a lot about which way to put them. I think I got it right, but see what you think. Okay, so at number 2, I've actually got his first album. And that is The Golden Age of Wireless. The original version started with a track called The Wreck of the Fairchild, and for some reason I can't remember exactly the ins and outs of what happened, but the album was re-released. I think it's because he'd had a couple of hit singles. I think that was it. He'd had She Blinded Me With Science, which was the sort of novelty pop hit that featured the TV scientist Magnus Pike, and One of Our Submarines is missing as well, which is an absolutely great song, great electronic pop rock song, electronica really. So the album got re-released with those 2 tracks on, and the rest of the tracks shuffled around a little bit. This is another album that lived in my car back in the day, and it's sort of a post-punk classic really. Groundbreaking album. He recorded it in a basement flat in Barnes using very primitive, well, not very primitive, but I think he had a bit of a homemade rig going on. It was before he'd invested in a Fairlight sampler, so he was kind of making it up as he went along, and using his knowledge of chord progressions and harmony, and just welding it with this kind of DIY, slightly bleak strand of melancholy electronic pop, and a really interesting lyrical thing coming through, a great interest in geography and history. Most of his songs, I think he described them as occupying this strange parallel universe of sort of faded European cities and the vast open tract of the English landscape. Great song, Wind Power on here, writing songs about wind turbines essentially. And the track Airwaves, which is an absolute, masterpiece of atmosphere. I think there's a reference in that to a pylon, standing in a field. Just a great sense of space, a great sense of geography and of history. That came through, the historical thing came through very strongly on Budapest by Blimp, on Aliens, Ate My Buick. He had a great interest in history. Funnily enough, he's just written a book actually. This tour he's doing at the moment, he's using it to publicise an historical novel that he's written. So that shows how interested in history that he was. Anyway, a great album, a great pioneering synth pop classic. It could have come at number 1. I guess the only reason it hasn't done it, I'm not saying it's definitely a negative, but it's maybe a little bit samey, a little bit one note. The tracks all sort of blend into each other, and it's sometimes difficult to remember which track you're listening to, but that can be a good thing as well. I think it's possibly his most cohesive record, and it's the one that most people kind of go to when they think of Thomas Dolby. This is the one, his debut album, and it's got a couple of sort of hits on it essentially, which is why it still gets talked about quite a bit. But I decided to go for my number 1 choice with his second album, which is the one that came out a couple of years later. I think it was 84. This was the one where he'd invested in a Fairlight synthesizer, so he was starting to broaden his palette of sounds, really, using samples, not just synthesizers now, but bringing in other instruments, bringing in ethnic instruments, ethnic percussion, bass guitar, but a slap bass guitar coming into the picture, all triggered from samples. Although he did have some musicians playing on his records. Kevin Armstrong, the guitarist, which he'd used on the first album, is back for this one. You've got Bruce Woolley on backing vocals. Bruce Woolley, the guy that he'd been in a band with, the Camera Club. Robin Hitchcock makes an appearance on this. And I just think I think probably this is his masterpiece, really. Just the quality of the best songs, I think, is what elevates this one. The Flat Earth and Screen Kiss on side 1 are just absolutely incredible pop songs. They're very filmic, they're very atmospheric, they're very melancholy, and they're just wonderfully done, just amazingly produced. Great use of samples, mixed in with this wonderful melancholy kind of atmosphere. On side 2, you've got Mulu the Rainforest, which is his foray into strange, I suppose you'd call it world music, really. Again, very filmic, very atmospheric, full of samples. Dissidents, the opening track, is just a really good sort of up-tempo kind of pop rock song. White City at the start of side 2, again, is quite sort of commercial, really. This album bombed again, really, as a result of various machinations on the part of EMI and stuff happening behind the scenes, all kinds of things. It should have been much bigger than it was. I think it was a major disappointment for him that it didn't become a big hit. I Scare Myself, which is a cover version, a Dan Hicks song, which is, I think, a really great song. And that was released as a single. And then the album ends with Hyperactive, which is possibly his most well-known song. You could slag that one off, really. It's definitely a novelty hit. I'm not 100% sure it fits with the rest of the album, but I can forgive it. It's good fun. Had a really fun video, and when I saw Dolby last week, that was a really great live version. It had everybody moving. It was just great fun. You know, I think maybe that's why it doesn't quite fit onto the record, because the rest of the album is quite melancholy and atmospheric. But that can work sometimes. You know, think of The Secret Life of Arabia on the end of Heroes. I think is a good example of that really moody album, and then it ends with this big rousing finale. It's kind of a bit like that, but maybe a bit more a bit more of a novelty song. So we'll have the Flat Earth on there, and yeah, all those tracks I mentioned. In fact, you know, every track on this album is great, I think. The Flat Earth at number 1. Just a couple of quick mentions of other songs that I really like. This is the soundtrack to The Gate to the Mind's Eye. This was a project, it was a film project back in, I think it was the 90s, maybe 94. A series of sort of art films, really, using computer-generated technology, and Dolby did some of the soundtrack stuff for it. There's a great track on here called Quantum Mechanic, and just a shout out to my friend David again, he turned me onto that one, put it onto a tape collection that I had in my car, and I just wore that out. It's a really great track, actually, a great, forgotten, I'd say pure synth pop track, really, from the 90s. Great fun. Quantum Mechanic. And then this is a CD which my friend David made for me back in the day. This is just, it's called Thomas Dolby The Long Album. It's just a compilation of some B-sides and things like that. And there's a great track on here called Puppet Theatre, and that's a great track too. Again, you know, very much more in that kind of synth pop kind of idiom. If you had to bracket Dolby, you'd say he's a synth pop artist, but there's so much more to him than that. I think he is a really versatile, accomplished artist with a great musicality to what he does, but you know, also he's just a classic boffin of the keyboard and of the sampler, and a great sound manipulator, great producer, and just a wonderful talent, really. And it was just so great to see him back. You know, he's made a couple of comebacks. A few years ago, we saw him live actually on this on the Soul Inhabitant tour. And this was a fair few years ago now, so this is really his second comeback as a musician. So we'll have to see how long that lasts. He's had a hair transplant in more recent times, and I think it's made him a much more confident musician. Last time we saw him, this is pre-hair transplant, he was basically just behind his keyboards all night with a kind of headset on, and we hardly saw him. This time he's out front with a microphone, he's doing dance moves. You know, it's clearly given him a shot in the arm, I think, having his hair back. And why not? Every man deserves to have a hair transplant at least once in their life, I think. I don't need it just yet, but you know, give me another 10 years. Right, hope you enjoyed that. If you're a Dolby fan, let me know how you would have ranked those albums. Any favourite songs you want to highlight? Anything you think I've got wrong or right? I'd be glad to hear about that. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.